Today, her focus will be on Coleridgean legacy in J.R.R. Tolkien, and I'm sure her talk will introduce us to many interesting and new ideas concerning the combination of Coleridge and Tolkien. And after her presentation, please feel free to ask any questions you may have related to the talk, or I'm sure that Dr. Juričková will be more than happy to answer any question related to J.R.R. Tolkien. Dear Martina, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can you see it?
Yes, we can see it now, yes.
Okay, so as an Oxford-born, Tolkien must have been well acquainted with the theoretical and philosophical work of Samuel Coleridge. Coleridge was one of the greatest British literati, and I dare say progenitor of the fantasy genre in the Isles. But despite his awareness in his published materials, Tolkien rarely ever directly named any philosophers or literary theoreticians he might have been inspired by when he was creating his own theory of literature, particularly informing his own views on the origin, nature, and purpose of myth, imagination, literature, and art in general. I am aware of only two indirect references that Tolkien made to Coleridge in his works, which are available to me. The first one is a painting entitled Xanadu. Xanadu was the dreamland where Coleridge's poem Kubla Khan is set. And this painting that Tolkien made is currently displayed on Tolkien Estate's website, and it proves that Tolkien must have read the poem. This is the most direct reference that Tolkien made to Coleridge. The second, more indirect one is found in his essay on fairy stories, in which Tolkien put down his understanding of the principles of art, literary art, as well as art in general. In its section on the relation of children to fairy stories, Tolkien criticized the concept of willing suspension of disbelief, which is a concept that Coleridge coined. However, Tolkien discusses the concept only in context of Andrew Lang's comment on children's capacity for literary belief, and he doesn't even hint at that Coleridge was the coiner of the term. Likewise, without any mention of his literary predecessor, Tolkien goes on expounding, correcting, and elaborating the definitions of the same core literary terms that Coleridge examined in his Biographia Literaria, such as imagination, fancy, and fantasy. So Coleridge outlines the distinction between imagination and fancy in chapter 4 of Biographia Literaria, where he claims that, much to his dismay, despite often being used as synonyms due to their linguistic origin, the terms represent essentially different faculties of the mind. Imagination comes from the Latin word imagination, which is but a translation of the Greek term Phantasia, from which fantasy and fancy are derived. Coleridge derives his understanding of these concepts from Ludovicus Vives, who defined imagination as the passive function of mind whereby we perceive sensuous impressions, and Phantasia as the active function of mind whereby we comprehend the impressions and combine them to create new thoughts. However, in chapter 8, Coleridge develops the definition of imagination to cover even the creative activity of writers, while he reduces Phantasia to the memory-based ability of the mind to construct possible scenarios, which are deeply rooted in reality, and he gives this ability the depreciatory name of fancy. The best example of fancy are, for example, daydreams of a lover who is thinking about interacting with their crush, or catastrophic expectations of a scaredy cat. In both cases, the mind fabricates hypothetical stories using its previous knowledge of reality based on the sensuous impressions. But since it does not invent anything new beyond what already exists, In reality, Coleridge finds fancy inferior to imagination. In addition, he distinguishes two kinds of imagination. Coleridge's primary imagination is equated with White's understanding of the term. It is the universal ability of human mind to receive impressions of the outer world, unconsciously and involuntarily recreating the image of the world in the mind. To quote Coleridge, it is the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. The second part of this sentence suggests that imagination is the ability to perceive through senses and learn about God's creation. Coleridge defines secondary imagination as an echo of the former, coexisting with the conscious will, yet still as identical with the primary in the kind of its agency, and differing only in degree and in the mode of its operation. It dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate, or where this process is rendered impossible, yet still at all events it struggles to idealize and to unify. It's essentially vital, even as all objects are essentially fixed and dead. So put simply, secondary imagination denotes the imaginative ability of poets, prosaists, and dramatists. Such twofold understanding of imagination brings to mind Tolkien's twofold understanding of creation. The proper or so-called primary creation denotes the ability of God to make everything out of nothing, while the secondary creation, or as Tolkien terms it, subcreation, refers to the creative and imaginative ability of man, not only in the context of story making, but also of crafting or art in general. Like Coleridge, Tolkien believes that secondary creation is analogous to primary creation, differing only in degree and mode. In addition, it is as innate a human ability as Coleridge's secondary imagination, because both mirror the creative imaginative ability of God, for the reason that man is made in God's image. So basically, we can put an equation between the secondary imagination and subcreation. Except that Tolkien extends the meaning to include all forms of art as well as invention. The more significant difference is found on the primary level. Tolkien's concept of creation denotes the life-giving creative power of God, while Coleridge's definition of primary imagination denotes human's perceptiveness to the result of God's creation, that is, the created world. But that's just the difference in the point of view on the same creative process. As this diagram shows, Tolkien and Coleridge, they describe essentially the same interaction between man and God, however, each from the perspective of a different one of the two opposing agents who are acting upon the same subject. So the common subject is the creation, the created world, and the two agents are God and man. God uses his creative power to make the world, to bring it into existence, and then man uses his primary imagination to perceive the world and recreate images in his mind. So we have already established that Tolkien's subcreation can be, in a sense, identified with Coleridge's secondary imagination, but where in the comparison does fancy and fantasy fit? Tolkien agrees with Coleridge that the capability of human mind to form mental images of things is actually present as the capability of the mind to create images of things which are not actually present in front of you is imagination. In Coleridge's theory, the capability belongs to the primary imagination. However, Tolkien criticizes the idea that the mental processes that Coleridge covered under the concept of secondary imagination and fancy represent entirely different faculties of the mind. Instead, Tolkien thinks that all the three capabilities, fantasy, fancy, and imagination, belong to imagination as the umbrella term, and they vary only in the degree, not in their kind. So far, that seems to be only a conflict of terminology, and it follows that for Tolkien, subcreation is also but a degree of imagination. But as subcreation pertains to all forms of art and invention, story making, which Coleridge recognized as the only proper subject of secondary imagination, then turns out to be second level subspecies of subcreation, so to say, in Tolkien's terms. Fantasy as a degree of imagination, whereby we make up stories that are detached from our primary reality, therefore they are fantastical, is that third level subspecies of subcreation. I try to visualize the relationship between all these concepts in the following diagram. So we have here imagination as the umbrella term, and it covers three things or three elements. First is the primary imagination as it was defined by Coleridge, that is the capacity of human mind to visualize some images of things that are not present. Then we have fancy, which again, according to Coleridge, is the ability to create hypothetical scenarios. And we have subcreation, which in Tolkien's terms is the ability to exercise human creative power. Subcreation can be basically exercised not only in art, but also in all other forms of craft or invention. So it includes like scientific inventions, crafting of some useful tools for everyday use and something like that. And then we have art as a separate kind of artistic expression. In turn, art can be divided into secondary imagination, which Coleridge thinks is the only proper form of story making. And then we have other forms of art like painting, sculpting, film art, and so on. And finally, in the last level, secondary imagination, or simply put, story making, is differentiated according to the literary genres which the writers use. Tolkien basically defined fantasy as a unique separate genre. And then we have all the other genres like detective, sci-fi, novels, romances, whatever else. Coleridge, he does not really identify any special genres or modes of imagination, except for the customary kinds of literature that have been known from the classical Greek era: prose, poetry, and drama. This division is, however, based on the form of the text rather than on the contents. In a side note, Coleridge considers the last two, poetry and drama, and especially their combination, dramatic poetry, as the highest mean of execution of the faculty of secondary imagination. While Tolkien partially agrees with Coleridge in the case of poetry, in Tolkien's opinion, the highest form of art and subcreation is fantasy. Tolkien's approach to fantasy is unique for two reasons. The first reason is that Tolkien was basically the first one to define fantasy as a separate literary mode or genre. And this genre can be to a certain degree realized in each of the three literary formats. So fantasy can be realized both in poetry, drama, and prose as well. In Tolkien's opinion, fantasy is best realized, of course, in prose form and seconded by poetry. In drama, it can be realized only very imperfectly from reasons which are derived from a point which I will explain in a moment. Basically, Tolkien believed that a drama limits the perceptive or imaginative ability of the reader. Therefore, it's not suitable for the execution of fantasy as a genre. However, to conclude the first reason, when Tolkien established fantasy as a genre, this is possibly the reason why he's often nicknamed as the father of modern fantasy. So it's not because he would be the first one to write fantasy. There were writers before him who had written fantasy, but he was the first one to define it as a independent literary genre. The second reason why Tolkien's approach to fantasy is unique is that he restricted fantasy solely to narrative form. In note E to his essay on fairy stories, Tolkien explains that literature works best from mind to mind and is thus more progenitive. In his understanding, the reader's imaginative participation in the story is an essential part of fantasy as a mode of art. By visualizing the narrative in their minds, readers also become sub-creators. So to paraphrase Chris Salmon, one of the scholars who studied this aspect of Tolkien's literary theory, just as man actively participates in God's creative activity, the reader participates in the writer's creative activity by the act of imagination. Thus, we can say we arrived at a second level of sub-creation, or so to say, sub-creation. Basically, God is the ultimate creator, while man writer imitates God's primary creative power by fabricating stories or even universes of his own. Thereby, writer becomes a sub-creator. However, in the relationship between reader and writer, the writer in turn becomes the god of his fabricated universe, and the reader, when he's trying to replicate in his mind the visions of that the writer set down in paper or in text, the reader then becomes sub-creator in his own turn. The visions of the writer and reader, or even multiple readers, can of course vary because each of them has different experience of the world and perceives things differently. In the process of primary imagination, each person got different impressions of the world. But that's only something which adds to the fantastic experience and makes literature all the more enchanting. Every attempt at its outward visualization, either through illustration or dramatization, is then considered detrimental to the realization of the full potential of the reader's imagination. While Tolkien was somewhat lenient about illustration, as he himself illustrated his stories amply, he was very critical about dramatization, particularly on-stage performance. He believed that dramatization not only prohibits the spectator from active participation in story making and limits him to just being a passive recipient of somebody else's visions, but he also believed that dramatization is more liable to outrun and even overthrow the mind. This then leads to grotesqueness, and it makes it hard to suspend disbelief. Tolkien exemplified his disappointment with dramatization on Shakespearean drama, which is in contrast with Coleridge, who praised Shakespearean's works as the most high-quality form of art for its ability to reconcile poetic creative power and dramatic intellectual energy. So that's a point where these two literati differ considerably. However, it's surprising that Coleridge did not see this aspect of drama as a downside, because when he shared multiple views similar to Tolkien's regarding the function of literature, and in Coleridge's case, particularly the function of poetry. He also shared with Tolkien the opinions on the effect which art should have on the reader. In chapter 14, Coleridge, of his Biographia Literaria, Coleridge writes that poetry brings the whole soul of man into activity with the subordination of its faculties to each other according to their relative worth and dignity. The poet diffuses a tone and spirit of unity that blends and fuses each into each by the synthetic and magical power to which I would exclusively appropriate the name of imagination. Coleridge then continues by claiming that this power is all the while controlled by will and understanding. In Tolkien's view, fantasy likewise brings the whole soul of the reader into activity and is also controlled by reason. Because if a man, a reader, was not able to distinguish between the fantastical and the real, the person would not be able to enjoy the juxtaposition of these two elements in fantasy. Tolkien exemplified is that on the image of a frog prince or frog which is turned then into a prince. So if humans didn't have the reasonable knowledge that distinguishes frog from a human, they wouldn't be able to appreciate this magical aspect of fantasy when the frog is turned into a human. But in order to fully submerge oneself in fantasy with the whole soul, according to Tolkien, it's not only enough to pretend that we do not know, it is unreal. This is called the willing suspension of disbelief, as Coleridge defined it. When we are reading something, we have to pretend we do not know, this is not real. However, according to Tolkien, it is also necessary to embrace the secondary reality of the fabricated universe. And this is something in which drama falls short, because due to it being staged and the impossibility of executing the fantastical as seamlessly as it is in reader's mind when he reads, the observer in a theater can never fully feel immersed in the narrative as if he was reading. Instead, the observer in the theater is basically just the spectator who is looking at the secondary world from the outside. There's always the feeling that you are sitting in the audience and the play is going on in front of you. So it creates the physical distancing, and this allows for greater immersion in the story. But of course, drama is not the only form which is susceptible to the breaking of spell of secondary belief. Basically, any narrative form can do this if it's not able to maintain what Tolkien terms the inner consistency of reality. This means that not only the secondary world is kept consistent with its inner rules, but also that the fantastical world has to be, in terms of metaphysics and basic morals, consistent with the morals and metaphysics of our primary real world. So even in stories, fairy stories, fantasy, good always needs to be good and evil needs to be evil, just as much as it is in the primary world. And the same ultimate truth needs to be communicated because both of these worlds are essentially rooted and are a part of the eucatastrophic master story of salvation. And this is the point in which both Tolkien and Coleridge agree again. So they claim that literature, fantasy, and poetry respectively should incite in readers a sense of wonder, curiosity about God's creation, help them recover a clear view which is freed from the bounds of science and technology, and which is tied more to the inner vision of soul. Furthermore, it should provide pleasure as its immediate end and allow us for an escape from one's dreary reality. And finally, it should aim at the sublime revelation of moral and intellectual truths, the absolute of which is embodied by the ultimate being, which is God. So that is for my presentation. If you have any questions, you can ask now.
Professor, please.
Okay. So first and foremost, thank you very much for such important, in a way, presentation, and I like it because it is what I really appreciate. I try to understand what the word is, what an art is, and so on. And my first reaction is just to say something, then a question for you. We said sublimate revelation, yes. The ultimate being or God, yes. What is sublimation? The sublime. The sublime, or what you call, as I dealt with, mysticism. It is timelessness and spacelessness. When time and space go away, we get what we call the absolute. And this absolute means it has no space, no time, and this is God. And this is also the primary imagination. It is beyond our reach. But we said the secondary imagination, yes, secondary imagination, which is within our imperfection. The first is the perfect, the second one is the imperfect. Within one's imperfect, we try to make perfection. And so, in other words, the primary imagination is where God creates the universe, which is the plot of God. The plot of God, the universe. And the novel is the plot of man. So, two worlds, the world of God, the absolute, and the world of the artist, in a way, and both have used words. God said, God is a verb. With the verb, he makes the world. And the artist, with the verb, he makes his own world. That's why I said, creating a world within this world. So I have two questions for you. When you write, when someone writes, who writes exactly? Is it the conscious I or the self? And which self? And if you say, I'm conscious when you write, why do you isolate yourself when writing? Isolation, either you paint or you write, you must isolate yourself first. You can never write within a public and you take a novel or a poem. The second question, is imagination a conscious act? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions. Well, as far in my research, I'm more concerned with Tolkien's work. So as Tolkien defined it, or as he understood it, the creation itself is when God created the world. And writers, artists in general, they exercise, it's almost like in this biblical parable of the talents that the writers, they have to use the talent that God gave them to write about and to basically celebrate the gift that they got from God, and they, through their art, they have to teach people some moral standards, some basic ultimate truths, as you mentioned. And Tolkien believed himself that in every act of sub-creation, there is this little speck of God's creation, or God working through the writer and basically giving him ideas what to write. Or in Christian terms, we can say that this is the inspiration by the Holy Spirit working in the writer. And can you repeat once more your second question?
Which one? I said, is imagination a conscious act? And I said, the other one is, who writes when you write? We have the I or your other, because artist said, when I write, I am. It is my other that writes, not my conscious I. This is the okay. Imagination, is it a conscious act? Imagination. I mean the secondary imagination. The second imagination, not the first one. Of course, the first one is beyond us, is of God.
Possibly partially conscious and partially unconscious. As Tolkien said, there is some inspiration which probably he gets from God, or however you term it, some greater being which is beyond the world. And then there is the conscious effort of the writer to embellish the story. Tolkien himself was known for on one hand, he said that his writing was as if he wasn't inventing it for himself, but that he was writing something which already existed, as if he knew it through some kind of spiritual knowledge, and he was just writing what already existed. So this is the part where he was inspired by the Holy Spirit or by God. And then he was also known for very meticulous writing and rewriting of all of his materials. He was changing a lot throughout the stories. And basically, he was never satisfied with the final outcome of his writing. So he always kept editing and adding something or removing some pieces from his writing. So this is the conscious part of his writing, that he was trying to make it into a form which he would be satisfied with. But he was a real perfectionist for himself.
Thanks a lot.
I'd like to have a question referring to one of the functions of literature that you mentioned, that function of literature is also to help readers recover a clear view freed from the bounds of science and technology and tied more to the inner vision of soul. My question is it just by reading that readers may recover this clear view, or what's essential for this to be developed from your point of view?
Oh. Well, the ideas that Coleridge and Tolkien represented in their writings, and especially in their theoretical work, they are pretty similar. Coleridge, he was focused solely on poetry and drama. Tolkien, he was focused mostly on fantasy and myth making. However, in the process of sub-creation, as I mentioned, he included all forms of art as well as creation. So through basically, he believed that these ultimate truths about God and the universe, they can be revealed not only in writing, but also painting, sculpting, in whatever other forms people exercise their talents, creative talents.
Yeah, but I mean, from the position of a reader or someone who perceives the work or reads the work, is it just that I read it and the truth may enter my unconscious mind, or how can we understand it? How can I develop this inner eye or inner view, clear view, more clear view?
Yeah, so
yeah, what's the part of reading in it, or what are other aspects that have impact on it?
Yeah, Tolkien developed this idea a little bit further. There are a number of stages. One of them is like when the reader reads the text, it makes him to look at certain points from a different point of view, provide a different perspective, either in terms of like moral consciousness or something like that. So the reader, through identification with the characters or through observing the characters in the literary work, can start questioning first the behavior of the characters, and then he can reflect the qualities or personal qualities of the characters in the book on himself and start questioning his own behavior, his own morality, and maybe to make him look at the world and at his own life in a different perspective. And how the different perspective is provided, it doesn't necessarily relate to just some moral truths or morality of the characters, but it can be also provided as a point of view or different angle of view at everyday things. Tolkien there quoted Chesterton and his idea of how you look at the coffee shop and there's the door and a letter or a title on the door, coffee shop. But when you look from the inside, the letters are reverted and you see it from backwards. And this makes you, or this creates a new feeling of curiosity, what this backwards word can mean. and this provides also a new angle of looking at everyday objects. So yeah, and basically because the word coffee shop, when you look at it from the back side, it has some kind of enchanted feeling to it, like it's some magical word or some incantation, and this provides a life of readers or of people with some kind of or sense of magicality, that there is something more beyond this everyday world, beyond just the scientific explanations.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah, go on.
First of all, thank you for your wonderful presentation. And I have actually two questions. So the first one, can a writer control the imagination of a reader? Because there are some thinkers who believe that, like Jean-Paul Sartre, they believe that the role of a writer ends when they finish, or when a writer finishes his work. So it's up to the reader to create a new word. And the second question is, what is the role of subconscious in the imagination? Thank you.
So the writer limits, of course, the perception of the reader to a certain degree. It depends on how specific the writer is in his descriptions in the literary work, or how much space he leaves to the imagination of a reader. There are writers who tend to leave everything open, like they are not very specific in the setting descriptions or the description of the characters. They focus just maybe on the conversation, like Hemingway, or on the other hand, we can have writers who describe everything into small details, the smallest details, like you can really imagine what the setting looks like, what the room looks like, where the characters are. You can even imagine it almost like the individual lines on their face or some specific features. So I think, yeah, this is one way how the writer limits the reader's experience of the literary work. But still, even though no matter how specific the writer is, the reader has a different experience of the world. So in his mind, he can imagine things differently than the writer. Yeah, and Tolkien exemplified it on the on a like a piece of bread, that if a writer states somewhere in his text that the character ate the bread, so the writer can have a different idea of how big the bread was, what it was covered with, what material it was made of, and the reader, because he's accustomed to different kind of bread in his or her country, can imagine bread as being totally different than what the author originally meant. So these are the small differences in our everyday life that make the readers perceive the literary work differently.
Thank you. What about the second question?
Can you repeat it once more?
Of course. Since the imagination is an endless inner realm, what is the role of subconscious?
Well, in terms of reader imagining the text, you mean, yeah? I believe that it's something similar to how limited is the author's or the writer's process of sub-creating, that there's some part in his subconscious which we can term is the power of God or the Holy Spirit working in the writer, and there is this active focused activity where he writes and rewrites. So I think something similar works in the reader, that on one hand we have the conscious experience of the world, on the other hand we have some unconscious, or even if it was based on consciousness, we don't remember it as as well. So it's just some impression back in our minds, which can pop up. It's similar maybe like in dreaming, that in dreams, you can have some elements recur which you don't remember from your life, from experiencing them, but they just got stuck in your subconsciousness. So I think with imagination, it would be pretty much similar, like with dreaming. That some parts of what you imagine, you recognize that you really consciously remembered from somewhere, from your experience. And then there are elements which you don't recognize because they are just in your subconsciousness.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions?
I have one brief question because I haven't read Tolkien's notion about disbelief, but is secondary imagination connected to secondary disbelief? Is it the same?
He mentioned there the idea of the willing suspension of disbelief in relation to the perception of text, that we as readers, of course, know that when we take book into our hands, that it's not something real, it's just something which the writer imagined. But in order to enjoy the story and submerge into it, we pretend that what is in the book is reality for us, for the brief moment while we are reading. This is the conscious suppression of disbelief. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
So if there are no more questions, I would like to thank Dr. Juričková for her interesting talk. And it's 11:45, so we can move on. But I'm just trying to find out, do we have next presenter with us? That would